All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the Bonn climate negotiations. We are now only, let's see, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 3 days away from Paris, if you think in negotiations talk. In absolute days, I think it's about 40 days or maybe 30 days or something like that, where we're itching very, very close to the negotiations. And obviously, if you've been looking on, but if you haven't, don't worry, we'll update you. There was a lot of private negotiating meetings yesterday where negotiators are really diving into some serious negotiations about exactly what they want to see in the text. And we're going to have some updates for you on how that went, which is obviously a key reason why you might want to join us today, because a lot of people, even here in Bonn, weren't allowed into negotiating rooms yesterday. And some of the insights we're going to share with you are insights that literally not many other people in the world actually know right now. So thank you so much for joining us. It's going to be a big day of updates. We've just gone through some of the Adopt a Negotiator tracking team that we have here. If you have been watching the blog or some of their kind of work, look out for Renee Karanungen, Vanessa Bolivar, Lucia Vasquez, Thais Gadialara, and Elena from Macedonia. They are some of the great writers we've been introducing just now as you've been waiting. We have some special guests today that have been working a lot on keeping the fossil fuel companies or organizations, maybe companies, out of the climate negotiations. And we have some great updates also from Sustain Us later on in the day. But let's kick off first to Christian, who has some key insights from yesterday's negotiations and also some great media hooks that he's going to introduce today. So Christian, what's your update so far?
Right. It's slimmer than Chris would promise. It's a slim little page in my little book, and that is a result, obviously, of the fact that these sessions are closed. I'll talk about the closed sessions and what civil society is doing, might want to do about it in a second, but maybe first a few bits and pieces, the mood music that I picked up in the NGO meeting earlier this morning following yesterday's negotiations. As you know, few people were in unless they had maybe pink badges or snuck in or something like this. But overall, I think we are a bit on an emotional roller coaster. Everybody was very nervous on Monday when this text got reopened and felt like, oh God, now so much is going to be put back in again and it's going to balloon. Then yesterday morning, everybody was fairly relaxed because overnight, apparently, it looked like parties were disciplined in what they were putting back in, just 14 pages, not too bad. So that seemed to be a reason for optimism, and also the substance of what had been added. As you remember, yesterday we talked about how most of the sort of NGO experts felt that whether it was on long-term goal, on finance, on adaptation, or whatever, good language had been added, mostly helpful stuff that the NGOs would want to see in that text. Now, when then the parties went into the spin-off groups yesterday to negotiate these issues, and some of you, I don't know, might have your own take on this, but the sense I got across the board was that was rather messy than yesterday. So people who talked to mitigation negotiators reported back that it was difficult in the talks and that they had a rather confused discussion, for example, about the long-term goal with weird language proposed by some parties, whereas others highlighted on the flip side, on the positive side, that, for example, Colombia supported the decarbonization language that the Americans had put in as part of one of the insertions, one of the surgical insertions. And for those who are not clear or familiar, the decarbonization language is relatively important in the long-term goal context because it points to an actual, journey out of fossil fuels and into renewables, whereas other language about low carbon development or whatever may not send the same clear signal. So there were some good news out of the mitigation discussion, apparently, but overall it sounded messy and difficult. Similarly, on finance, apparently those conversations kicked off in a rather good mood and good spirit, where parties wanted to sort of show that they engage in good faith, etc. But what became clear then, apparently, was that the umbrella group of countries, so some of the northern developed countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, Japan, etc., are a bit at odds with where the G77 are in terms of what is actually being discussed on finance. The difference was described by one of the climate finance NGO veterans as a narrow versus a broad discussion about climate finance, where the umbrella countries are looking at it broadly in terms of sources of climate finance. A lot of talk about the private sector and its role, whereas the G77 want to focus and zoom in on support. So not so much a broad financing discussion, but something about how to mobilize the support that they need for their actions. Do we have a problem? No. There was not much detailed intelligence on some of the other areas of conversations. This is just to give you sort of a sense. It may continue in a similar vein today. One important detail, I think, that we sort of touched on briefly yesterday, and that I wanted to bring up again, is the status of this text that they're currently negotiating. As you remember, before the Bonn session, it was just a non-paper, and the official negotiating text was still the long document from Geneva in February. After the insertions from Sunday to Monday night, from Monday to Tuesday, it had a new headline, and the new headline suggested that it was now something like a draft text. But one of the co-chairs, Dan Reifsnyder from the US, said yesterday, I don't know, in one of the meetings, that the legal text is still the Geneva text, and that would probably get dropped in Paris in order to be replaced with the one they are negotiating on now. Nobody was really clear on what that meant, but it raises questions about the sequence and the timing of, which text comes on when, sort of, in terms of the legal text. What is the legal text, as far as I understand, is not just a decision in the plenary like, hey, okay, we all agree this is no longer the legal text we deal with, this is now the legal text we deal with. It's not as simple as that, apparently, but to make a text the legal text, it has to go through the UN system, get translated to all sorts of languages, etc. So it's not a trivial exercise to make a text the legal text that is the foundation for negotiations. I guess it smells a bit like they will work on this text now, this currently 34-pager, until the end of the week, and then probably hope to take that away from Bonn and make it the legal text for Paris, somehow going through the necessary UN procedures between the sessions. But I'm not an expert on the legal issues. Maybe that's something for a guest tomorrow. And I would take what I've just said with a grain of salt. But that was the sense in the room this morning. Finally, I want to update on the reason why we know so little about the discussions in the negotiating groups, in the spin-off groups. And that's obviously the exclusion of civil society from those meetings yesterday. I imagine that several of you stood out there or here at the conference center this morning blindfolded to protest against the exclusion of civil society groups. The understanding is, in case anybody missed that information yesterday, that this is mostly because Japan raised objections to observers being in the talks. It would be too simple, apparently, to just blame Japan, because others who then silently agree are essentially equally to blame. So any other party that does not object to the Japanese proposal, some did object. I think the G77 and a few others raised the need for observer access. But I think the Japanese position can only be overturned essentially if more people speak up and if the Japanese are singled out and feel the pressure to back down. So a suggestion in the meetings this morning was that one should speak to those parties one could expect to maybe make this point. In the past, the European Union member states or even the US would have sometimes stood up to make the point that observers should have access. So I think encouraging them is a useful thing to do. There are even conventions like the Aarhus Convention that some of these countries have signed, which essentially guarantee observer access to these kinds of international processes. So it's not just begging for access, but it's making the point that there essentially is a right to access. These documents and hints have been shared on the CAN list. Maybe we can somehow try to share that with those who are not on the list. And finally, I think there was a discussion about how much emphasis to put on this issue of exclusion. So actions, Twitter, eco articles, blogging, etc. I think while everybody in the room this morning in the NGO meeting agreed that it is important to have access, there's a bit of a risk that if we play this up too much, that it sort of distracts from the important substance we are all lobbying for. So keeping the right balance there is important, and maybe using protest against being excluded to also pivot to the substance and talk about that. Because the perception amongst journalists or public audiences easily very cynical. Easily we can be seen as a self-centered group of people who care about their access but not much else. So I think we should make our point. We should point out why the civil society is needed in these negotiations, how we can play a productive, constructive role in bringing this forward. There are briefing papers even on that from previous such situations, but maybe not coming across too much like, the disappointed bunch that sort of insists on something that is far removed from the substance of the talks. Final bit that could be fun today, tomorrow. You already saw perhaps in the Eco newsletter today the first article, which takes a very humorous take on what happened yesterday. I just read the headline: consensus reached on scaling up financing through increased cafeteria sales, because everybody was sitting in the bloody cafeteria yesterday instead of negotiations. If you haven't seen it, read it. It's very funny. I don't know, maybe the author is even here, Ben from New Zealand. And I think they will follow up on this as long as access is not granted. Rumors are being collected, funny, humorous rumors about what might be going on in the talks. So I think we'll get a rumors article tomorrow, as a funny way to highlight, hey guys, as long as you don't let us in and let us comment on what is really going on, we'll comment on funny rumors. So if you know funny rumors about what could be going on, I think find a girl called Lena from Can and give it to her, or tell one of us and we'll find a way to get it in. That's the end of this update. And with that, I think we should go into a Q&A, Chris, with Jesse about their activities and the issue of corporate engagement in the talks, but especially their campaign launch today.
Sure. So Jesse, we met you briefly before we started recording, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself again?
Sure. My name is Jesse Bragg. I'm from a NGO based in the US called Corporate Accountability International.
And what is the aim of Corporate Accountability International?
Well, we are a human rights and environmental NGO. So before our climate work, we focused on targeting corporate abuse that has specific consequences for human rights and the environment. So the basis actually for our climate campaign is in our work with the WHO, the World Health Organization, on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which was the first corporate accountability and public health treaty at the WHO, and sets a whole myriad of public health and tobacco control policies to protect us from the tobacco industry.
So we're basically thinking that the WHO, or I guess the international community, stepped in and made tobacco companies accountable for some of the health impacts. Do you think there's a direct alignment with what's going on with fossil fuel companies? Is it really that simple?
Nothing is really that simple. Of course, there's, even with the tobacco treaty, there's a whole lot beneath that top line. But the one piece that we're looking to carry over from our work at the WHO is this provision called Article 5.3, which creates a firewall to mitigate the different ways that the industry tried to interfere in, delay, water down the policies that were being developed within the talks.
So there's actually regulations saying that they can't do these sort of things.
Exactly. It's legal precedent that exists within the UN system currently that is clearly not being that is not part of the UNFCCC process. But when we look at different things like the Lima Paris Action Agenda, which includes non-state actors, cities, investors, people, but also over 1,100 corporations, there's a need to make sure that not only that the types of corporations that we're involving are actually sincerely interested in the solution, but that their businesses aren't predicated on emissions, on pulling fossil fuels out of the ground.
And how do you differentiate, I guess? There's obviously a registered business group here, and there's obviously a lot of groups that, wind farm companies, solar companies, and things like that. So there's obviously a lot of what you might consider like, yeah, really legitimate reasons why businesses in particular might want to be involved in these negotiations. Potentially, I'm guessing you're going to say there's a lot of illegitimate reasons as well. How do you differentiate between that kind of, you have a real good reason to be here versus potentially you're just trying to slow things down?
It's a great question, and it's something that the delegates within the FCTC, the Tobacco Treaty, had to confront as well. And I think that the easiest, and it's probably overly simplistic, but the easiest answer to that is that the first thing needs to happen is the policy, the treaty, the agreement needs to be developed, insulated from that influence. Then we can decide who is brought in on what terms. But again, this is obviously a party-driven process. So ultimately, that policy will need to be developed and determined by the parties. But the first step is just recognizing the conflict of interest inherent in the American Petroleum Institute or Business Europe being influencing delegates, influencing national positions before delegates get here.
And have you seen any kind of clear examples of what you would call, I guess, abuse of their opportunities and their representation from fossil fuel companies? Are there any kind of moments when you were like, yes, this is exactly why we need the treaty?
Well, I think that one of the most public and relevant to all of us right now is looking forward to COP21. You have the French presidency has rolled out a list of over 20 corporate sponsors to help pay for the COP. They want to finance at least 20% of the COP with private funding, which in itself isn't inherently bad. But when you look at that list, you have corporations like EDF and Suez Environment and Engie. And between EDF and Engie, you're looking at 50% of the energy emissions for France. So why is it? Who could possibly think it's a good idea to have, in some terms, there's a saying, I don't know if it translates across, but letting the fox guard the hen house. You're not only letting the fox guard the hen house, but they're paying for it too.
There are photos of foxes inside the hen house.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're let in, they're bankrolling the whole operation, and they get preferred access for it.
So it's like a doggy door at the back that they can kind of sneak through.
Exactly. And meanwhile, organizations like ours and yours, I'm sure, are trying to figure out how we're going to get into the blue zone. But we have, but if you have millions of dollars and you happen to burn coal, you can sponsor the talks and get access that way.
So do you have some sort of idea on potentially how you can try and limit this influence right now? Is there something you're working on right now?
Yes, yeah, we're working with civil society, a lot of different NGOs and delegates and parties to figure out what is the most appropriate course of action within the text to move this forward. There are, this whole process is incredibly complicated, but there are which means that there are numerous ways that this could play out within the text, and we'll see what parties ultimately decide. But the first step here is an acknowledgement within the text that there is a conflict of interest between the fossil fuel industry, at least, and we all know that other industries are very carbon intensive as well, but at least the fossil fuel industry and the intended outcomes of the treaty.
All right, so this is something that I know young people in particular, and especially some of the people we have in this room have been campaigning for and have been very passionate about in the past and probably still are. Are there any questions out there in terms of maybe some of the things Jesse shared, or maybe some of the things that individually people are doing that might be kind of in partnership or along the same lines of some of this campaign?
Yeah. All right, so we're just kind of bringing a computer over.
We have the beautiful Vanessa Bolivar, who is currently taking our microphone around. All right.
Maybe as a direct question, because you regulations on access should happen from, should they be intrinsic to the agreement, or they can be set up in a different space where it might be easier to progress through that, such as, I mean, it's unlikely that WHO will set up something like that, but in another UN organization which would be able to kind of build those defenses against undue influence.
So is your question specific to the UNFCCC or just in the UN system overall?
I would say the UN system overall, probably.
Look at across the UN system, this is a problem. There, more and more, we're seeing, for whatever reason, I haven't quite landed on it. More and more, you're seeing different institutions within the UN looking to private industry to help finance initiatives. And the questions that need to be raised is, what does that do to the end goal? What does that do to the process? So in terms, I'm not an expert on the UN overall. I think there are certainly codes of conduct that the UN could implement for itself and different ways to mitigate that. But within the UNFCCC, there could be a declaration from parties. There could be something in the text. There's a whole different, there's about 5 or 6 different broad things that could be done to do this. But the question is, what do parties think is most appropriate?
Well, do you actually have something that you're planning to do today? I mean, I've heard in the waters that there are some,
Thank you for that
key
reminder.
moments.
Yeah. So today we're launching a global platform to engage people who are not in this room, in this body, on this issue. I think it comes as a surprise to many people that this is going on in perhaps one of the most important international treaty negotiations yet. The future of our world depends on it, and we're selling it away in some sense. So today we launched kickbigpollutersout.org. It started as a movement in the US. It already has over 350,000 people behind it. And our end goal is to deliver over 1 million signatures from around the world to the UNFCCC. We'll see exactly who, calling for this to happen. And we'll do that delivery in Paris.
And are those 350? Looking to actually crowdfund to try and offer an alternative sponsorship program to the COP.
If anyone has a couple $2 billion they're willing to put towards this, we haven't had any trouble on finance so far, so it shouldn't be a problem. No. We want to get this as widely promoted as possible. The important thing is the people that with the moral grounds to speak on this, the people whose lives are affected every day, need to know what's going on, and they need to get their voices heard. It's one thing for people in the US to say, this is a problem, and yes, we recognize that our country is responsible in a big way, not only with the problem, but perpetuating it. But we really want to engage with, the global South, areas where the effects of climate change are being felt in a very, very human way now.
For sure. Well, that kind of wraps up our update on the Kick Big Polluters Out. So that's kickbigpollutersout.com or .org?
Both go to the same thing, .org.
You just bought all of them?
Yep, we bought them all. That way, Total doesn't buy one and then put something else up.
For sure. Good idea.
But I'm sending out a release today. We'll have a panel tomorrow on the same subject at 11:30 in Nairobi 4. But if I get you the press materials, could you circulate them to?
We definitely can.
Great.
So expect some circulation of press materials from kickpollutersout.org and kickpollutersout.com. We'll have and .net. All right. Did you go .co as well? That's
we may have stopped there.
Okay.
We made a budget for 3 probably.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass on now to Christian, who's going to introduce some of the other kind of updates on what's happening, particularly in regards to Japan and some of the other kind of really exciting things happening today.
Yep. Thank you. And in case you haven't figured it out, today is Bearded Guys Day. It's in the calendar. That's why we could only have people on the panel with beards. Tomorrow, I think we'll do better and have people without beards, maybe for once, for a change. Because now we go to the next one of those, of that species, Alden from Sustainers. And before we hear from him about Japan and ECA's Export Credit Agency funding for coal and what Japan has to do with it, I want to give you a heads up on one other thing that is happening today, and which is perhaps a good starting point for what Alden will explain about tomorrow. The thing today is a launch of coal phase-out briefings by E3G, a think tank NGO from the UK, and they have looked at the G7 countries and at their recent June G7 summit promise to go for long-term decarbonization and essentially phase out fossil fuels. And they're looking at progress among these countries in terms of how they're doing on phasing out fossil fuels, and I guess maybe also covering funding for fossil fuels. That's going to be released today by E3G and their friends here in Bonn at a press conference at, it's probably happening now actually, 10:30 local time, so I think they're at it. That should be out on the email lists later. So if you're interested in this, I think it maybe gives good context for what Alden and the Japanese colleagues are working on. So maybe, I don't know, if you want to come here so that we can hear your voice as you talk into this. I'll ask a few questions about what's going on with Japan, and then we can again throw it back to the room and see if anybody else has follow-up questions on all this. So maybe first of all, could you give us a bit of context, not about tomorrow, but about the wider story? What's the deal with Japan, with coal, and these ECA things?
Sure, I can tell you what I know, which not sure on the acronyms, but as I understand it, the Japanese government is one of the main subsidizers of Japanese industries that are major players in the coal power plant construction industry. And so they are across primarily Asia at this point, constructing a lot of power plants that, based on coal, that they're claiming are highly efficient, and in some cases are actually claiming them as climate finance because they say that they are better than other plants that could be constructed for coal. And so I guess that's the basic context I know.
Yeah.
Want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think that's the specific issue. Maybe it's worth to throw a few other things in the mix from the past few months that come to my mind right here before we talk about the action and the thing tomorrow. I think Japan has really worked hard to give itself a bit of a bad reputation. I don't know if you remember the Japanese INDC, but here you have a country that does not necessarily see the writing on the wall in terms of the growing shift from renewables to fossils. I think as a result of their troubles with nuclear power following Fukushima, Japan is strongly interested in expanding its fossil fuel business at home and abroad through its industries and export credit agencies. Some months ago, there was quite some outrage, I think, when the Japanese suggested that Green Climate Fund money should be used to fund clean coal projects abroad, which really can't be the point of Green Climate Fund money. I think just yesterday, as we talked about earlier, they failed to make new friends among civil society here in these talks by suggesting that we should all be locked out of the room. So Japan is perhaps in a tricky spot, and tomorrow they will be in an even trickier spot because you're going to do something to raise the profile of some of these issues. So what is happening tomorrow, and maybe how can people engage and support?
Yeah, so a coalition of Japanese CSOs as well as Oil Change International are holding an action tomorrow at 9:15 a.m. Bonn time to sort of highlight the role of the Japanese government and their subsidization of these industries, and the sort of need to shift financing, especially at this point, away from coal and into renewable energy. So tomorrow we're going to be having a banner, hopefully marching down the stairs. We're still waiting to hear back on what the action proposal will actually let us do, chanting in English as well as in Japanese, so that although we cannot target Japan as a country, it'll be pretty clear. And we'll have currency symbols, possible fake blood. So it's going to be a spectacle, and we hope to see you all there. You can also support on social media if you are up at 3 a.m. in the U.S. for some reason, but around the world, you can look up what time it'll actually be. We'll be sending out tweets. We have some sample tweets. We have a press release, and one of my Japanese colleagues is actually just here. Hello.
No worries.
No worries.
I think we are doing well here. Let's just continue. Did you want to say anything else about the action or what's going on tomorrow, or was that it?
That is all I know as of right now. I know there are talks in Cannes International about actually awarding a fossil of the day to Japan, I think mostly for their role in kicking NGOs out, but we're seeing if we can team up with them to include coal financing in there as well.
Great. I think that gives us a sense of what to expect tomorrow and where it happens and when it happens. It sounds like people are welcome to show up and help, and if not, then to help on the airwaves with tweeting and so forth. I guess we should make sure that materials that come through on any list get forwarded to the lists where you can get them. Yeah, then let's see if it tickles the Japanese a little bit, along with the pressure they're getting here about the access of civil society organizations. And if we see some reactions, maybe there will be follow-up. I should ask if anybody has questions on this or contributions or additions.
Could I say real fast on the follow-up, there is a International Day of Action on stop funding fossils generally. That'll be November 14th, sort of coordinated by Oil Change International, and the Japanese Prime Minister is one of the main targets because of their coal financing. So there will be actions around the world, I think at some Japanese embassies in Asia Pacific region, to target them specifically, but also maybe keep an eye out for other actions on fossil fuel funders for November 14th.
Okay, well, thank you. Any questions on this? No, doesn't sound like it. I think we have 5 or 10 minutes left. Thank you, Alden, for this. And also thanks to the Japanese people in the NGO community for putting it on and for coming. I guess if you have further questions or whatever, now 2 colleagues you can walk up to and ask afterwards. Chris, should we see if there are any other things that people want to throw in on the table?
Yeah, sure. Does anyone else have any kind of critical updates? There was obviously a big action this morning that was on a similar topic, I think, about kind of making sure that there was many people as possible inside the negotiations. But does anyone else have an exciting update to share? I think there's too much excitement to actually share any of it. It's kind of bubbling up so much. All right, go for it.
Have you already heard of the press conference that we're sorry.
Mention it.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a press conference to mention.
Yeah, at 3 p.m. And we are talking about the road to Paris, what the Jews want to have in the agreement. And we make statements like for our working groups, like what do we want in terms of intergenerational equity, in terms of human rights, gender and women.
Okay, so just for everyone who didn't quite catch that, at 3 p.m. today in Bonn Standard Time, so that's Central European Time, there'll be a press conference run by young people here at the negotiations, and they'll be talking about some of the key issues that they really care about. You can all follow that live on the unfccc.int site. Just look for the press conferences on the homepage, and you should be able to watch that live just like anyone else who is here at the negotiations. Just on that, if you are watching on to the negotiations, you can watch a whole host of press conferences throughout the day, not just the one at 3 p.m., but there's press conferences all throughout the day, and that's probably another space where you'll find similar updates, but perhaps even some more open information about what's been going on in these negotiations. You can also obviously access the Earth Negotiations Bulletin or the Third World Network Report, which gives you a clear insight into some of the things that have been going on inside these negotiations through some very, very useful back channels that they get information. Sounds like that's a wrap up for the day. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been
yeah, I don't know if it's the right time to talk about the understood.
Yeah, okay, so it's been a great update. There is one more update. If you go to I guess YouTube at the moment, but very soon to the Climate Tracker site, there'll be a great little video update of the action that took place yesterday, where young people were asking for more transparency in the negotiations, and there may be a little bit of a Twitter update and maybe some actions that you can take part on as well. We'll keep you updated throughout the day and let you know. But for now, there's obviously a lot of exciting things to jump into the negotiations, a lot of great topics on the table today that could or could not be made or broken. So I hope you can continue to stay with us. Look for updates on the Tck site and the Adopt a Negotiator Climate Tracker site as well. And hopefully we'll be back tomorrow with another exciting update with a few more guest speakers and definitely a few more key women voices here at the negotiations just for your listening pleasure. Thanks everyone who's been listening online, and thanks everyone here in the room. It's been a great start to the morning. This is Wednesday from the Bonn climate negotiations. We are 3 days away from Paris, and we couldn't be more excited. Thanks a lot.